Okay, everyone, it's just after 3 o'clock p.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. Very happy to welcome you to this session on alternative fuel vehicle signage. Thanks to all of you for joining. We have a great panel today, which includes Diane Turchetta from Federal Highway Administration, Timothy Sexton from Minnesota Department of Transportation, Landon Masters from the South Carolina Energy Office and Palmetto Clean Fuels, Julia Gold from Rhode Island DOT, Don Howe from California DOT, and myself. I'm Dave Roberts. I'm at the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, or VIC. We're one of the contractors to a FHWA Oregon DOT pooled fund on alternative fuel vehicles, which is helping to underwrite the planning for this webinar. And a little more details on that in my slides coming toward the end of our discussion today. So we have all of these folks have some great experience on signage issues related to alternative fuel vehicles. We're looking to have each presenter spend about 5 to 10 minutes on their what's been happening in their area or state or at federal highways. And then at the end of the session, we'll have time for Q&A. So we hope that you are able to type into the chat box any questions that you have along the way. And if by some chance that we aren't able to get to all of those questions, we'll do our best to follow up with a Q&A document to all the registered attendees after the session is over in the next few days. And we are recording this webinar, so you'll have that for posterity. And we'll also be providing a PDF of the slides, a link to that following the webinar to all the attendees. So with that, we thank you all for joining, and I'm going to turn things over to Diane Turchetta to kick things off. So Diane, I'm handing off the control to you. And
okay, thank you very much, Dave, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to talk a little bit about Federal Highway's roles and responsibilities for highway signage and the designation of alternative fuel corridors. I think everyone's aware that Federal Highway publishes the manual on uniform traffic control devices. And I forgot to change my slide, so let me do that. Which sets national standards for highway signage, and Federal Highway also has a responsibility to designate alternative fuel corridors under the FAST Act, which helps identify infrastructure needs and inform the traveling public. So the two of these together, obviously, they need one another. We need consistent signage on our highways to help folks who are driving alternative fuel vehicles locate the stations. So today's webinar will just provide an update on some signage issues, which are basically will be speakers from state DOTs and the State Energy Agency. We'll leave that to the states since they're the folks putting the signage into the ground. And we'll talk a little bit about the latest on the alternative fuel corridors program, which I'll give you an update on what's happening with round 2 of the designations. There's a little bit of a lag in between slide changes, so just hang in there with me. So just to take a step back, under the FAST Act, as I mentioned, Federal Highway has the responsibility to designate corridors that employ electric vehicle charging, hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling technologies. The FAST Act said that Federal Highway needs to identify near and long-term need for the infrastructure at strategic locations along major national highways. And no funding was authorized for this particular provision in the FAST Act. So I think, excuse me if some of you already know this information, but just quickly, FY16 was our first round of designations. Nomination results, we received about 34 nomination packages, and basically put those packages into one of 2 categories, either a signage or corridor ready, which meant there were sufficient facilities on the highway corridor to go ahead and install signage, or signage corridor or pending designation that just meant that there were some gaps in that corridor and need a little bit more work before, some major work, but some a little bit more work before signage could be installed. So at the end of the day, designations included portions or segments, or in some instances, entire lengths of 55 interstates and a few state roads and highways, and covered about 36 states plus the District of Columbia. And all the decisions we made based on our signage ready and signage pending designations were based upon DOE's alternative fuel station locator. So we work with NREL exclusively on analyzing and designating those corridors. So the FY 2017 designations, we received 24 nominations, and they were mostly from state DOTs, but we had a few others, environmental and energy agencies, MPOs, one governor's office, and one economic development authority. We had 14 new lead applicants. So there could have been already corridors designated in some of these states, but this is the first time that they initiated an application. And 10 repeat states, you can see them there listed. So really happy to receive those nominations. So if you look at combined round 1 and round 2, based on the approval of some briefings I have this week and internal briefings at Federal Highway, we should have 58 nominations. Well, we do have 58 nominations, but we should have covered at least 44 states plus the district with both rounds 1 and 2, and covered 71 corridors plus a few state roads and highways. So back to the signage a little bit. As I mentioned, Federal Highway has responsibility over the MUTCD. When we rolled out the Alternative Fuel Corridor program, our colleagues in our Office of Operations at Federal Highway developed a signage memo that basically provided guidance to states on how to use the signage. And the first signage, I'm happy to say, was installed on I-94 and I-26, I-94 in Minnesota, I-26 in South Carolina. Two of our speakers will be addressing that today, and the next slide has a few pictures of those. And of course, as always, some questions remain on, general service signs and specific service exit signage. But, we try to answer those as they come up, and developed a frequently asked question document that you can find on the Alternative Fuel Corridor website that hopefully answers a lot of those questions. So you'll see these signs again, but I'm very proud of these. The I-26 sign and the I-94 sign, we'll leave it to Landon and Tim to talk more about that. Let me just go over a couple next steps. As I mentioned, we have some internal briefings on the second round of designations in Federal Highway this week, and we're preparing the website for the new maps, the new GIS maps that we're developing. And also, if you remember from the last site, there were tables that basically describe the pending and the corridors that are pending and the corridors that are ready. So we'll have new tables on the site, and we're also getting ready to implement 5 regional alternative fuel corridor convenings that will be over the next in 2018 and 2019. And we're trying to identify areas that are have corridors in common, regions of the country, that we can help folks collaborate, maybe do the workshop or convening, answer questions about funding or anything we can do to help them in terms of if they have a corridor pending, to get the signage ready, or if there's a corridor running through their state or region that does not have a designation, how to get that on the map. And a few examples there are we're particularly working with Florida and Indiana, and probably many people know that there were several western mountain states that signed an MOU to develop EV corridors. We'd certainly like to go there and do a convening. And as I said, we'll be really focusing on states that really have no corridors. Obviously, our goal here is to build out the network across the country. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Dave.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And I will pull up Tim Sexton from Minnesota DOT will be next. So I'll just give me a moment and we'll get his presentation ready. And just a reminder as I do that, folks that have any questions, please use the chat box to let us know what those are so we can address those following the presentation. Tim, I believe you should be ready to go. If you want to...
All right, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to share what's going on in Minnesota today. So Minnesota worked with a number of states that I'll get into in a moment, but to apply for and we're designated in the round one alternative fuel corridor for Interstate 94 between Michigan and Minnesota. And in particular, we applied for the zero emission corridor status. And in Minnesota, we are focused entirely on electric vehicles versus hydrogen or other zero emission fuels. Let's see if this is working. I'm trying to advance and having some trouble here.
All right.
There we go. So a little bit of context for Minnesota, which I think is important. The reason why we're focused on zero emission fuels in particular is that we do have a Next Generation Energy Act, which is in statute that has some greenhouse gas reduction goals. So electric vehicles, we believe, are going to be an important part of that. You can see here that we're not currently on pace to achieve those goals. So in terms of some various sector breakdowns on greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota, also important is you can see here that the trends for transportation, really Minnesota DOT doing nothing. You're seeing about a 70% reduction, but the utility sector in Minnesota has cleaned up really quickly and is one of the leaders in the country, in fact. And so electric vehicles have the ability, obviously, to take advantage of that cleaner electricity generation sector. So the state also established a goal by 2030 to have 20% of the fleet, and that's just not the state fleet, that's all vehicles, all light duty vehicles in the state of Minnesota to be either EV or plug-in hybrid electric. And so you can see we've got a long ways to go. Right now we're at about 6,000 registered EVs or plug-in hybrids, and the goal would be to get to about 20,000 by the year 2030. So we thought that corridor status is a great opportunity to, to provide some motivation and get some energy going around electric vehicles. And you can see here, this next slide, as far as the current DC fast charging network. This is what it looks like. That cutout on the right is the metro area, just because it's a bit cluttered there on the left-hand image. But we do have 4 additional stations planned to be installed by the end of this year. And that is along Interstate 94, for those not familiar with Interstate 94. And so I mentioned initially, just very briefly, that we worked with a handful of states. And in fact, we worked with 5 states between the start of Interstate 94 in Michigan, and it extended to the border, the western border of Minnesota. Now, Interstate 94 does extend into Montana, but because this application was prepared pretty quickly, kind of very near the deadline, we just tried to manage expectations and working with just a handful of states and the city of Detroit as well. During the application period and since, the states continue to meet, and we've received offers of technical support from NREL and Argonne National Labs, also working with the local Clean Cities partners, in particular Clean Cities in Minnesota and Chicago area. So in terms of signage, which I know is the purpose of today's call, Diane mentioned that we did get some signs installed, and we currently have 4 locations with signs in both directions. I mentioned we have 4 additional DC fast chargers planned along Interstate 94 this year, and so we have currently 3 additional signage locations planned. So that's 6 signs total, because signs in both directions. We do our own internal fabrication and installation, which really reduces the cost and makes it a lot easier to get these up. So, in terms of direct costs, we're looking at around $1,000 per sign all said and done. And so within the other thing that we did within our traffic engineering manual was to identify specific sort of guidelines internally that we'll be using for installing these signs as far as where to put them. And so we've established we'll put them at the beginning and the end of the corridor. And as that corridor expands, we'll leave in the signage, but just move the begin and end pieces of that. We also have guidance for basically confirmation signs every 30 to 60 miles. And so this just gives you a quick example of our traffic engineering manual and some guidance that we have on those signs in particular, more specifically. This example down at the bottom, this rusty anchor, well, we haven't installed it just yet. This is an example of a logo sign. And what we've determined is that internally we would be, to sign the EV charging stations, that yellow bar that currently says EV access related to the rusty anchor, this would be used in places that it's not a traditional fueling station, so something like a Goodwill, which is a common location for DC fast chargers in Minnesota. This would be the opportunity to say something like Goodwill Industries, and then the yellow bar below could say EV charging. And what we've decided too internally is that would only apply to DC fast charging in the state. We would not be advertising level 2 chargers. And that is it for me.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. And next up will be Landon Masters from the South Carolina Energy Office and Palmetto Clean Fuels. And Landon, just give me a moment. I'll get your presentation ready for you. And just a reminder, if folks have questions, please use the chat box. So Landon, I think we're all set. You should have control.
Okay. All right, so hello everyone. My name is Landon Masters. I am one of the co-coordinators for the Palmetto Clean Fuels Coalition, a Department of Energy Clean Cities program here in South Carolina that is administered through our state energy office. And we are then housed within a state agency, the Office of Regulatory Staff. We're a little bit unique in the fact that it allows us a lot of opportunities as a Clean Cities Coalition housed in a state energy office. Allows us to take opportunities like the alternative fuel corridor designation and be able to act upon those as a state agency. So once we heard about the alternative fuel vehicle corridors, our DOT kind of passed the ball off to us and said, we don't know as much about this, so we're going to rely on you guys to kind of make the designations. What we did was recommend all of the major interstates in South Carolina for all of the fuels because why not? And then we got kind of our designation, which was more reasonable and probably looks like what a lot of the states did look like, where there were some all of the corridor or all of the major interstate was designated, or just parts of the corridor were designated, which does make it a little bit difficult when you're signing, and I'll show you that in a second. So our next step was to meet with our DOT once we got the designations, and first to educate them a little bit on all the alternative fuels and how the FAST Act kind of worked and coincided with this, and then started the discussion for the signage process. Their process is kind of 3 steps. First, we had to submit a request to them, then we got the approval or recognition of that, and then we got their cost estimate, so then we could move forward. We sent our request to them that was very detailed. They wanted a lot of details that we had to do in-house. I was sitting there and trying to figure out where the signs were supposed to go, because it was a little bit vague in the designation where it says, you know, from Columbia, South Carolina to Orangeburg, South Carolina, but didn't say specific mile markers or exits or anything like that. So these were all the locations that signs each individual sign would be placed. It was actually it was 64 different signs that would be produced and placed in 22 different locations around the state. That's the beginning and ending of each part of the corridors. It got to the point where it was a little bit difficult to visualize where these signs would need to be, and so I created a Google map for DOT, placing the signs on either side of the interstate for the beginning and end of each of the corridors, and even put in the little pictures of what signs were supposed to go which way on the corridor, especially I-26 in South Carolina, where the whole entirety of the corridor is designated for propane, but only a small sliver here in the middle of the state in Columbia, South Carolina is designated for EV, and a small sliver down in Charleston is designated for EV. So then we received a receipt of this request, and we could start to move forward with the fabrication of the signs and installing them. Here is cost estimate. The first cost estimate that we got, which was over $5,000 for the fabrication of all the signs, almost $5,000, $4,500, and then an installation cost of almost $3,000. But what we did was work with them to figure out what the most cost-effective way would be to put in these signs, and the total cost came out to be $2,092 for all of the signs and installation. We were very frugal. The SCDOT covered all of the costs to install the signs, and then we had the fabrication completed by the South Carolina Department of Corrections Prison Industry Sign Shop instead of internally in the SCDOT sign shop, which saved a lot of money. And then this is a picture of that corridor in I-26 down there near Charleston. And we have more information, including all these cost estimates and letters and correspondence, on our website, palmettocleanfuels.org/AFV corridors. That's where you can find all of this information. It got a lot of media attention. We got a lot of folks reaching out to us and asking questions about these corridors. Anytime a new sign comes up, you always get people wondering what it's all about. And then next steps for us are looking at exit signage. We've already had meetings with our DOT late last year to talk about these exit signs and choosing specific pieces of the corridor to do a pilot project on. So that'll be what we're going to be focusing on this year, and it's one of the reasons why we didn't submit any recommendations during the second cycle for the designations of the corridors. And we're hoping that this exit signage will show us a little bit more about the usage and how these signs impact usage of these stations. So here's my contact information. If you have any questions, you can ask them at the end of the webinar as well.
Great. Thank you, Landon. Great. So next up, we have Julia Gold from Rhode Island DOT. And Julia, I'm just...
Great, thank you.
Hand over control to you. So one moment.
All right. Let's see.
So
Thanks for having me, everyone. Happy to be here today talking about what we're doing in Rhode Island. It's kind of nice, I think, thinking about a small state that's just starting out with getting our signage in the ground compared to what South Carolina and Minnesota have done. So I'm going to speak a little bit on where we are with all of our planning. Just to get us started, and let's see if I can get these slides moving. For some reason, they're not going forward. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm from the Department of Transportation, but I wanted to let everyone know that the alternative fuel signage work that has been done in Rhode Island has really been a real collective effort. I've been working closely, and really my colleagues have been working on this longer than I have. I'm newer to the department, but we've been working closely with our Office of Energy Resources, the Department of Environmental Management, and our Ocean State Clean Cities office to do the planning around alternative fuel corridors and really discuss as a collaborative how we want to see it happen here in Rhode Island and what we think the best approach is for us as such a small state. So just for some background, let's see if this
I'll go ahead and advance for you. So just let me know when you want to go to the next slide.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. So just to give you some background, last year in the first round for the alternative fuel corridor designations, we were part of the New England Collaborative submission for EVs. So all of our Interstate 95 was designated as an alternative fuel corridor for electric vehicles. And then for this past submission, we worked with RIDOT, worked with our partners in Rhode Island to submit for hydrogen and CNG. So we have CNG available outside of TF Green Airport, and that's a public station. And we are excited about the new hydrogen station that was just built in Providence. They have testing going on there, and the official opening is going to be in the coming months. Dave, if you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So given the current designations and our hope for the upcoming designations, our plans are to install alternative fuel corridor signs at the entrances to Rhode Island on 95, both north and south, so at near the Massachusetts border, near the Connecticut border. Those initial installations will include the EV indicator sign, and as soon as we receive, any further designations for this year, we'll be installing CNG and hydrogen indicators as well. Next slide, please. So part of our consideration for the plans on how we do our signage, it's Rhode Island, unlike the other states that have spoken already, we're, as a state, only 48 miles long from north to south, and 95 is only 43 miles. So our exits are close together. We're a small state that I think has some different considerations when we think about not wanting to put too many signs on the interstate. And the piece that has really led the conversation for us is that we see the public education and exposure as the #1 priority for these signs. As an EV driver myself, I recognize that for most people, if you have an EV, you're not relying on street side signage to get you to charging infrastructure. You already know where charging infrastructure is, either before you're planning a trip or on your day-to-day commutes. I think that's similar for other alternative fuels, at least right now. And one of the things that we want to consider here in Rhode Island, as the infrastructure is changing so quickly and we see more and more being added, we want to take a step back and wait and make sure that we're planning our signage so that it is effective for the means that we hope it, for the role that we really want it to play. So especially for EVs, we don't feel that it's necessarily important to do wayfinding signage. Not only is it excessive for our maintenance staff to have to maintain those signs and maneuver around them when they're maintaining our highways and our right-of-ways, but we also just don't see it as a priority for EV drivers to have those signs. I think this sort of goes to what Tim was saying about advertising opportunities around DC fast charging. We don't have a lot of DC fast charging in the state at the moment, and so we want to wait before we start putting specific exit-based signage on 95 and see sort of where things are headed, because we only have, I think, 2 that you would really access from 95. We want to see how siting happens before we give preferential treatment to the companies that have invested in that infrastructure so far. So I think for us, we haven't committed to not doing those signs in the long term, but we want to have a better idea of how to develop a plan that is effective for Rhode Island and the size of our state. So next slide, please. So I wanted to show just some images of what we have happening for the spring. This is 95 southbound, so coming going into Connecticut. Yeah. So you'll see on the right, you can see the image of how we plan to install the signs, and you'll see the future use placeholders will be for the hydrogen and CNG, and we can always add to those in the future if need be. And the next slide shows the installation plan for 95 North. So this is coming into the state from Connecticut. And so these both are located right after we have sort of large Welcome to Rhode Island signs that were installed a couple years ago. So the alternative fuel corridor signs will be coming, sort of right after those welcome signs. You also notice that we chose not to do the begin and end signage. I think our feeling, especially because we're such a small state and the corridor is the full length of our state, that it wasn't necessary, and that it also could potentially cause some confusion as people go in and out of our state into Massachusetts and Connecticut, given that the corridor has been designated into those states as well. We didn't feel like it was necessary to say begin and end. So those are all my slides. It's the end of those. And if anyone wants to contact me with questions, they'll be sending our contact information around.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And next, we have Don Howe from California Department of Transportation.
Okay, Dave, thank you. My name is Don Howe, and today I'm going to discuss the alternate fuel vehicle signage and policies associated with California-specific versions of the MUTCD and the process for developing new signage standards. Just note, my focus is going to be on the general service white on blue signs, and I can be contacted for details related to regulatory signs and pavement markings that Caltrans, also known as California DOT, has developed with regard to plug-in electric vehicle stations. So I'm going to go through some key documents and basically review about 22 years of signing experience. We had the promotional thing that talked about the AFV webinar, had a here link under me, and it went to our Traffic Operations Policy Directive 13.01, and that was dated March 14th of 2013, which established sign policy and standards specifications in March of 2013 for zero emission vehicle signs and pavement markings, primarily for electric vehicle charging stations, and added the additional option to place a fast header plaque over the electric vehicle charging station symbol, general service signs, and plaques adopted pursuant to the Federal Highway Administration Interim Approval 13, and that was made available in April of 2011. It also identified existing signs available to alternate fuel service fuel providers. So I'm going to go through and do just a timeline. If you could advance to the next slide, please. General service signs are developed in California after consultation with cities and counties, law enforcement, where we get together in public hearings with what's called the California Traffic Control Devices Committee. And for these blue and white word message signs and symbols came later, began about 1997. And we've continued as we've transitioned to the 21st century, and we are beholding the modernization of our transportation systems and vehicles. So the California journey to develop the alternate vehicle general service signs began with the word message sign, electric vehicle charging stations. This was the general service sign, which was first developed for use in California in July of 1997. This has been on our California roadways since the 1990s. It was first included in the 2004 California supplement to the MUTCD and has been included in all subsequent versions. I've had responsibility for working on 8 editions of the California MUTCD, as we've refined the document. I've had lead roles early on since 1999 for Part 3 markings, and I transitioned to Part 2 signs in 2006. Next slide, please. You might wonder where the hydrogen sign showed up, came from. This hydrogen HYD down the front of the fuel pump general service sign, and the hydrogen educational plaque, which is optional to place below, was first published in the 2010 California MUTCD, and it was done under the date of 21st of January 2010. The HYD legend on the fuel pump was proposed to be consistent with other alternate fuels, such as D for diesel, E85 for ethanol, 85, and BD for biodiesel. Next slide, please. We did apply for California to participate in the interim approval 13, and go to the next slide, please. This is for the symbol sign that was adopted by Federal Highway Administration to implement the plug-in electric vehicle symbol with the MUTCD approved abbreviation EV. And of course, the awkward reality with an interim approval issued by the Federal Highway Administration is that the sign policy may not be included as part of the state's version of the MUTCD, and it must be documented, locations installed, inventoried, and if necessary, removed when FHWA suspends an interim approval, and depends upon the conditions of the suspending language in the interim approval for whatever reason. So until interim approval, traffic control devices is incorporated into the national MUTCD, policies for use must be segregated, not included into a state MUTCD or a state supplement to the national MUTCD. California made written requests, as was evidenced by the prior slide, to utilize the hybrid word message and symbol sign and receive written authorization to use the alternate electric vehicle charging station general service symbol sign, which we gave a California sign designation of G66-21B CA. And in adopting that in August of 2011, we went to the next step of establishing our statewide policy that I mentioned before, Traffic Operations Policy 13-01 in March of 2013. And sufficient to say, Caltrans has every hope that this EV charging station symbol, general service sign, is universally accepted, and that it one day will show up in the next national edition of the MUTCD, published by FHWA sometime in the future. We don't know when. And then we can finalize this in our California MUTCD. Our enabling document, the Traffic Operations Policy Directive 1301, which was linked in our Save the Date summary, was published in March of 2013. This was our official set of signs for guidance and regulatory signs that were developed after public hearings and application of interim approval 13, EV charging station symbols, general service sign, and we also added the option for a header plaque to install in an assembly above, which suggests fast EV charging. And it's for conditions of where you have it, you can get up to 80% total charge accomplished by a direct current fast charger in about 20 to 25 minutes. So for brevity, we opted to not include the initials abbreviation DC fast. So we've got that option in place above this G6621B. Now this has been further endorsed in the key document that Diane spoke about, which is the alternative fuel program that FHWA adopted in December. Next slide, please. And you've heard much about that, and it's exciting to see other states have begun implementation of this. California has been placing these signs on the left post of ground-mounted sign, usually the exit direction signs, as you come upon an interchange where these alternate fuels are available. And we have plans to look at the alternate fuels corridor assembly as has been shown in other locations. We're working with Taylor Jones in the governor's office to work with those corridors. And a state that's 800 miles long and 200 miles wide has lots of opportunities for this. We see mostly the opportunity in rural areas to put these signs out and let people know when they're away from their familiar locations near to home. In California, we have 4 fuels that we will feature: CNG, LNG, electric vehicle charging, and hydrogen. So one development, next slide, please. We did notice that in December of 2017, the FHWA published a pooled fund study in which alternative fuel signs were reviewed, and it did score the human factors readability of these signs, and they summarized it, said it's recommended the alternative fuel signs should include the gas pump symbol and a supplemental placard indicating what type of alternative fuel is offered, because it scored much higher. So at this point, we would like to encourage everybody to go with what the FHWA wants to have us implement for our various fuel corridors. And California's journey is stepping out and developing some of the first we've had a history of developing some of the first alternate fuel general service signs, and we've had quite a history in the last 20 years. We'll continue to work in partnership with the FHWA towards developing general service signs, and I would add supplemental educational plaques below that will fulfill the 5 basic requirements for effective traffic control devices to A, fulfill a need, B, command attention, C, convey a clear, simple meaning, D, command respect from road users, and E, give adequate time for proper response. It's been an interesting journey, and this has been an opportunity today to share with you a little of that in 5 to 10 minutes that we could discuss. Next slide, please. I guess this is the last of my remarks, but if you have any questions, put it in the chat box and I'll try to respond. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. As Don said, any questions, please use the chat function. We'll be getting to those shortly. One final presentation from me. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the other resources for drivers of alternative fuel vehicles to find fueling stations beyond signage. Julia mentioned a lot of the actual drivers of these vehicles are using apps or navigation systems built into the vehicles and not necessarily relying on signage. So signage still has an important role to play in sort of informing the traveling public of what's out there. And potentially in some cases, if a charging station maybe is a little bit harder to find, it may be necessary or desirable to have wayfinding signage, or if you're in an area where there's not great cell phone coverage for apps and things like that, then signage is still a fallback that can be really helpful. So once again, I'm Dave Roberts. I work at the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, VIC. We're working with the Cadmus Group and Atlas Public Policy to support the Alternative Fuels Vehicle Pooled Fund process, which is managed by Federal Highways and Oregon DOT, which this webinar is a part of that initiative. So in terms of some of the different resources for locating different alt fuels, the U.S. Department of Energy has their Alternative Fuels Data Center, or AFVs, station locator. As a link on this site, they include a number of different alternative fuels, so it's the best source for sort of a variety of information. The individual stations are verified by NREL or their contractors, so you have some assurance that these are actually out there in the world, unlike some of the other services that exist. And as Diane mentioned, this is the official source of information for the alternative fuels corridor designations because they are verified, and it's very reliable information. So and they do have a mobile version of this station locator as well as an app that you can use on a smartphone. So folks who are on the go can access it that way. They also have a trip planner, which will tell you what alternative fuels are available along a route. So this is just an example going from St. Louis to Los Angeles, looking at where CNG stations are. It's roughly following the old Route 66 path. And according to this, there's about 58 stations along the way. And the way that this is determined is in the search options. It's looking within about 5 miles of the shortest distance travel corridor to locate those stations. And you can expand the search distance and add additional parameters using the more search options on this if you want to explore that. There are also a number of different electric vehicle specific websites and apps. PlugShare is one of the more popular ones. A lot of people sort of think about it like Yelp for charging stations. If anybody's used Yelp, you can check in, which is the sort of second screenshot here is from a phone app is showing how you hit a button to check in. You can say if the charging station is working or not, which is really helpful for some of the particularly fast charging locations where maybe there's been some maintenance issues and the station hasn't been working. So folks can check in. This is an example of one that hasn't had a great history of reliability. It has a score of 4.6 right above the check-in button, which is circled in red there. And some of the user comments are noting this is at a car dealer and the cars are blocking the charging station, so they're not able to get access or having trouble activating the station. So this is a great way for EV drivers who are maybe planning a longer trip than they're used to have more confidence that when they get where they're going, that the charging station is going to be working. ChargePoint offers a similar capability. You can look at where charging station is available in real time through their app and website. And there are a few other options out there. These aren't the only ones, but these are some of the more popular ones. Another nice thing about PlugShare is you can have it filter the charging stations that it's showing based on your vehicle. So if I'm driving a Nissan Leaf, which has the CHAdeMO fast charging connector, I can tell it to just look for those fast charging stations if I'm looking for that. The automakers have their own in-vehicle systems. So a lot of them have smartphone apps that allow you to control when charging is happening, start and stop charging, turn on the heated seats and things like that remotely for comfort. If you're in a cold climate, that's really helpful. The shot on the right here is from the Nissan Leaf navigation system, and it's showing basically your estimated driving range based on the current state of charge in the vehicle. So it gives you that idea of how far you can go before you need to turn around or start thinking about plugging in somewhere. Similarly, here's a screenshot from the Chevrolet Bolt smartphone app, and this is showing sort of a dotted line around the 50% range estimate. So the idea is that's about as far as you can go and turn around and come back without having to charge based on your current battery state of charge level. You can put in a specific charging station as a destination, and it'll tell you here at the bottom, it's saying 80% state of charge on arrival. So that gives you pretty good confidence that you'll be able to get there without any problems. Tesla has a similar function for their vehicles, and Tesla really is very advanced compared to many of the other automakers in charging networks and providing a seamless nationwide network of fast charging for their electric vehicle owners. Unfortunately, it's limited to just Tesla vehicles. It's their own proprietary standard that they're using now, although perhaps at some point in the future that would change. So this is showing a trip planner going from Vermont down to, if I wanted to visit Diane in Washington, D.C., and maybe one day I'll have a Model 3, I don't yet. So if I did, I could do that in 3 stops, and it's even telling me about how long I need to stop at each of those locations. 35-minute charge in Kingston, New York, and then 2 more 25-minute stops along the way. And if I'm doing this nonstop, I might even be able to do it in just about 10 hours. So some really helpful resources, and Tesla has an even more advanced system built into their vehicle screen navigation systems to help drivers navigate to their charging stations. So just wrapping up then, so as part of our Alternative Fuels Pooled Fund, there is a website, altfueltoolkit.org, which is linked here. And this includes a number of great resources for folks who are interested in learning more about alternative fuel vehicles or planning their own strategy for how they're going to increase use of alternative fuel vehicles and acting on those strategies. So this has been developed, as I mentioned. Cadmus Group is the lead contractor on this, and Atlas Public Policy and VIC are supporting that effort. So a lot of great resources on there, and encourage folks to check that out. And then just a few final resources. I wanted to make sure folks are aware there's also the West Coast Electric Highway signage resources, which are linked toward the bottom here. Some good information there about what's happening related to that initiative, as well as a link to some legislation that Washington State has passed related to regulatory signage, so allowing police to enforce no parking except for electric vehicle charging at charging stations. So with that, that is the end of our prepared remarks, and we do have some time for Q&A here, so I'm going to so we have a number of questions, and I'm going to just start at the top of the list. We'll see where we can get here. So on the federal, this, I guess, question for you, Diane, and the presenters, you might want to take yourself off mute if you've been muted. So question is, to confirm, the Federal Highway Administration workshops will be focused in areas or states where no corridors were designated. Is that correct?
This is Diane. That's part of it. I mean, we'll also be focusing on areas where corridors have a lot of gaps, and we want to change those corridors from, you know, signage pending to signage ready. And it just depends on, you know, who the champion is, you know, around those corridors and where we can organize the most effective convenings or workshops. Yes.
Great. And the question is, will any of the convenings be located in California, Oregon, or Washington?
We haven't really determined where they'll all be yet. Once we do that, we'll let everyone know.
Great. And can you, Diane, another question, can you say how many new and approved corridors seem to target heavy-duty vehicles as opposed to passenger cars?
Oh, boy, that's a tough question. That's a cut I haven't looked at yet in terms of, I guess, looking at CNG and LNG. We had quite a few nominations for CNG this time around. I would have to say folks would be, will probably be pretty happy with the CNG map when they see it. But I haven't done exactly a corridor by corridor analysis of that.
Yep, great. And does the AFV corridor effort coordinate with the truck parking initiatives? Follow up to that, it would be good to ID areas that need truck parking and can be EV charging to meet that need.
We haven't exactly made that connection yet, but I know that's an extremely important issue and one we'd like to do in the near future.
Great. Question for Minnesota and South Carolina presenters. Do your respective DOTs have policies against signing conventional fuel stations within urban areas? And if so, how does this impact the location of your corridor signage?
In Minnesota, I'm not sure about a formal policy, but we don't typically do that. And for the alternative fuel corridor signage, we've done it outside of, mostly outside of urban areas, and some, I guess we do have one in sort of an ex-urban area, but I'm not sure about a formal policy.
Yeah, I would echo that here in South Carolina. I'm not the traffic engineer in the state, so I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that.
Okay. Diane, is there a 2018 date set for corridor not recommendations, and guidelines or requirements going to be similar, do you think?
As far as we know, there will be a 2018 nomination call. We'll try to keep the same timing. I can't give specific dates because we don't know that yet, but we'll try to, as usual, issue something in the fall. And if we can possibly provide more time for the nominations for states and stakeholders to pull the nominations together, we'll do that. But we'd like to kind of stay on the same time frame, issue it in the fall, get nominations, late fall, and make announcements in the spring. So hopefully that's what we'll follow. And I don't know yet if there'll be changes. We'll determine that when we sit down to write the new request.
Another question, can DOE share these presentations to the Clean City SharePoint site? We will be providing a PDF, and I don't see any reason why that sounds great. So if folks need more on that, they can contact us directly. Question related to, I guess this would be, I think, Tim in Minnesota, you mentioned Goodwill. So will the Goodwill Industries with EV charging plaque then apply for the logos program under the fuel category? You have any thoughts on that?
Yes, that's exactly how it would work. The same way that we do other logo signage, where the vendor or whomever would have to apply for it and pay some amount of money to do that advertisement.
Okay. And what specific service category would the Goodwill Industries fall under? Gas or fuels? The question.
That's why we have the supplemental messaging. So the idea is that it would fall under fuel.
Yep. So another question on the presentations, and yes, we are providing copies. As I mentioned, all the folks who have registered through the GoToMeeting should get a copy, a PDF of the presentations afterward. Question for South Carolina, did South Carolina use state funds or for the signs or federal funds?
These were funds through the Energy Office through the Clean Cities program. So it was a mixture of state and federal funds.
Okay, great. And question again for South Carolina, can you review exactly how you chose the particular locations for the corridor signage?
I believe that it had a lot to do with the proximity to other signs that were around the area. Like I said, the designations weren't very specific in a mile marker or an exit sign. It was just, the Columbia, South Carolina to Orangeburg, South Carolina. So it all depended on where there were other signs that were, around that area.
Great. And a question about how do state DOTs plan to roll out directional signage and track impact on station utilization? I guess that's open to anybody. Maybe Julia, is that anything that you've thought about for Rhode Island?
Well, we've decided that right now we're not going to do any directional signage, specifically for EVs. I think, if we get the CNG and hydrogen designation, we can further discuss whether or not the directional signage is needed. But our feeling right now is given that we have so few DC fast charging stations, we're not committing to do wayfinding signs at the moment.
Yep. And
I'd just like to weigh in for.
This is Landon again in South Carolina. Like I said, we're looking at doing a pilot here in South Carolina along one of the designated EV stretches of corridor, and we're looking at signing specific exits. We haven't come up with the entirety of what that criteria is. That's something that we're going to be working with pretty in depth this year with DOT, is to get that pilot going forth, and we do see it as more of a marketing outreach initiative for us.
And in Minnesota, we've been struggling with this because oftentimes the wayfinding is a bit more complicated. If it's not a traditional fuel provider. And so I actually really think the Rhode Island approach makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to be taking that back to our traffic folks.
Great. So a question for Julia. What vehicles are expected to be served by the hydrogen station in Providence, at least initially?
Yeah, good question. Well, we just had a meeting with Toyota, and last year we had the delegation from California's governor's office and Toyota, Honda, and I think Hyundai was here as well. Initially, the manufacturers are looking, I think, to start building a market on the East Coast. So, they're really investing all along the East Coast. And we have new hydrogen stations that have been built or in the process of opening in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. Our state government, we're looking at whether or not we can work with the manufacturers to potentially showcase some of the technology. So similar to Minnesota, we have a goal for by 2025, we want 25% of all of our state fleet vehicles to be zero emissions. So we're interested in, trying out hydrogen vehicles such as, the Mirai, or even looking at the Hyundai SUV especially for our maintenance and construction staff that need bigger vehicles. So it's a great zero emission option for DOTs that need larger vehicles, that need to go off-road onto construction sites and things like that. So I think down the line, we're really interested in looking at that as an opportunity. But so my understanding is, at least initially, the manufacturers are trying to market the personal vehicles, but I think there are larger vehicles, medium and heavy duty vehicles being developed as well.
Yeah.
But I'm less familiar with those technologies, so I don't think, at least not in Rhode Island, I'm not aware of any bigger industries, or our transit agency is not looking at like hydrogen buses or anything right now.
Yep. Great. So we do have a few more questions. I know we're a little bit over time, but I think there's just a few more, so I'm hoping we can get through this. So thanks for your patience, everyone. This is an interesting one that I think I'll direct to Don, at least initially, but others may want to weigh in. So has there been any thought given to differentiating between level 2 and DC fast charging on the signage? A long distance traveler in need of DC fast charging that follows signage to a level 2 site will be rather disappointed. Similarly, there's an important distinction between high speed fast charging over 150 kilowatts, for example, and comparatively slow speed DC fast charging of 25 to 50 kilowatts, and distinguishing between the different plug types. So there's a lot of variation in the speed and plugs for fast charging at this point. And Don, you mentioned you have the supplemental plaque of fast to at least get part of the way there, but have you thought more about further distinguishing by power or plug or anything like that? Are you thinking that that's best left up to some of the apps and things like that?
Well, in our policy, we did say that the fast electric vehicle charging station is where the rate of battery electric charging is at least 20 kilowatts in a 30-minute period, and 20 kilowatt hours in a 30-minute period. So fast charging stations include direct current, fast charging, and battery switching. So we haven't had much in the way of battery switching interest. I think down in Los Banos, Tesla was hoping that they would have something like that, but there was just no interest in somebody switching out their batteries for something else. So basically, that's how we define it. Is if it's just basically plug-in EV charging, if it just says has the symbol, and if it's at least 20 kilowatt hours in a 30-minute period, it would qualify for a fast header plaque. So that's how we simply put it. We didn't say level 2 CHAdeMO or different plugins. We know that there are some. I think there's a interest by some other states that will identify a Tesla charging station, but we have shied away from that. We just basically want to go with a generic where it's available for all chargers, or for all types of EV charging.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? So, question for Julia. Can you talk about the different types of expertise the Rhode Island collaborators have brought to the alt fuel corridor effort and how they complement each other?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things I would like to say is, because we're so small in Rhode Island, we can all walk to each other's offices basically, and it really allows for some nice collaboration. So I think, Wendy Lux, who's on the call right now, she's from our Ocean State Clean Cities office and has been involved in this work for many years. So she's done a lot on alternative fuels, advocacy, education, similar to, how a lot of the Clean Cities offices around the country work. Ryan Cote is from our Office of Energy Resources, and he does a lot of work around electrification, our Charge Up program, so that helps to incentivize state entities and municipal entities for getting funding for charging infrastructure and purchasing electric vehicles. And then Allison Callahan is from our Office of Air Resources at the Department of Environmental Management. She does a lot of work on the air quality side of things, and coordinating with NESCOM and coordinating with Ryan and the Office of Energy Resources. And then I'm with the Office of Sustainability and Innovation at DOT. My background is in climate change and urban planning. So we all come with sort of a different skill sets, but, I think basically having the same goals of wanting to ensure, the best future for our transportation sector, benefiting, the health and well-being of our citizens in Rhode Island, and ensuring, a productive and accessible transportation sector that offers, people options for mobility, with a focus on the environment. So there's a lot of collaboration going on in Rhode Island to do this planning overall. So we're fortunate to have such a nice network.
Great, thank you. And so 2 more questions I think we'll have time for, and then we'll need to cut things off. So next one, I was wondering why none of the states seem to be considering adding biodiesel to the corridor designations. Is that anything anyone can address?
Hey, this is Diane. As the federal highway alternative fuel corridor program exists, it does not include biodiesel, and that's just because it was not included in the provision of law, and we didn't have the authority to add it. I suppose it's up to the individual states if they want to go ahead and designate, but it is not part of the federal program.
Thanks, Diane. And then a final question, do the states participating on this call utilize the last in corridor sign when only one type of alternative fuel is offered within the corridor?
We did not. We did not put up those signs here in South Carolina.
Yeah, and we're not going to be using those signs just because the size of Rhode Island, it doesn't really make sense for us.
Right. And
California, we have yet to establish our overall statewide policy on whether or not. I just thought it was a good sign to put at the end of my PowerPoint presentation.
All right, well, with that, I think we'll need to cut things off. If we weren't able to get to your question, then keep an eye out. We'll try to follow up with some additional resources or materials if there's anything that we missed. So thanks all for your participation, and then especially thank you to our presenters for taking the time to share their experience today. And as we mentioned, we'll be following up with the PDF of the slides, and the recording will be available for folks if you'd like to listen in again. So that, I think we'll conclude the webinar, and thank you all for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.